Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 9th of September 2023. Check out the map legend on the screen. Pause it if you want to see what my lines mean in my mapping. Okay, we're going to go to the front line and we'll see that actually there aren't too many pins on the maps. There's not going to be a great deal of change from what I told you this morning, just a few nuggets to add into that. There are a few areas of very heated exchanges, but there's not a lot of territorial shifting going on because I think, well, partly in the Robotyne area there's a lot of fortifications still to consider. Velika Novosilka, I think it's just a little bit quiet in that general area, although as you'll find out in a second, there seems to be quite a lot of activity in Donetsk and Novomaiorske axis. And then elsewhere, the usual sort of situation. If we go to the Institute for the Study of War, and we'll be starting at the northeast, the Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, there are apparently some, Russian claims that they are making advances in the Sinkivka area, but again, that's not always evidenced elsewhere. In fact, Yevlash, a spokesperson for the Ukrainians, has stated that Russian forces are continuing to concentrate efforts on the Novomaiorske area and are using convict recruits and unspecified private military companies to conduct assaults in that area. So that is coming down from the Sinkivka area to Svatova, and here the Ryarodka to Komartinivka area here. Novomaiorske is this little village there. That is the center of a lot of attention at the moment. The Russians have lost an awful lot of mechanized equipment here, but they have gained a small bit of territory over the last few days. Nothing in the last 24 hours, but they are trying very hard. And the idea is that they are trying to move towards Borova. That's this place on the Oskil River, or very close to the Oskil River, that comes down through Kupiansk, Oskil, and meets the Sversky Donetsk River down in the Liman direction. But the Russians, it is thought, are trying to get across to the Oskil to give themselves a buffer between the Luhansk Oblast and places like Svatova, so that the Ukrainians are kept at bay. But I think that's just far too much for the Russians to consider taking. I mean, they're really struggling to take Novomaiorske, so I don't really count their chances of taking Borova. Nonetheless, that's what the claim is. Yevlash, spokesman again, has stated that Russian forces continue to train and form assault units from previously defeated motorized rifle brigades and airborne units in the area. So Yevlash also stated that Russian forces are using signalmen to form assault detachments, suggesting that recent heavy losses may be constraining available Russian manpower for assaults on the sector. Ukrainian officials have previously noted that Russian forces are deploying elements of newly formed brigades and divisions to resume active offensive operations in the Kupiansk and Liman directions, although ISW has not observed confirmation of any of those deployments. I mean, this is a claim that we keep hearing, that there are newly formed units I've been suggesting they will be from troops mobilized and training in Russia and then brought to the front line here, but the claim is that they are made of existing units that have been degraded and shoved together to form new units. Either way, that is what they're using to supply the front lines here, whilst at the same time there's also been a claim that the more established units from this sector have been moved down to help in places like Bakhmut and the southern front line. So quite a bit of rotation going on, but still they're pressuring the Ukrainians, particularly around Svatova. And then, usual kind of claims for many of these other places. We'll come down to Bakhmut next, so not too much to report, certainly no major territorial changes there. And in Bakhmut, the same can be said for Bakhmut. It is a case of fighting all around Bakhmut, particularly just north here around the M03 or the E40 highway coming into the north of Bakhmut. Some talk about attacking towards Orikovo-Vasilivka here, the Russians, but also obviously down south between Klishchivka and Kurdyamivka. There were claims yesterday that Avdiivka and Kurdyamivka had been liberated. They were kind of shut down by people like Null Reports, who said, as you can see here, to counter some rumors, Avdiivka and Kurdyamivka have not been liberated yet. I'm fairly sure, after double checking, this rumor is certainly a wrong interpretation of a message from Bakhmut Demon, a fighter on the front line there, who actually says it will be ours and not it is ours. It will be ours. On the other hand, there is an advance of the Ukrainians north of Avdiivka, completely encircling it from the north, south and west. The town itself is a grey zone with no more Russian presence. Okay, and then just now, this claim's come out from Tim White. I have not seen this claim anywhere else, though. Ukraine is in complete control of Avdiivka near Bakhmut. So this is, as I say, just now that's come out. And I don't know that that's based on the incorrect claims that Noah Reports was referring to here, or these are new claims. But I assume there'd be new claims. Previously, Russia was still present in the village, but been forced out in the latest offensive. The suspected grey zone in Klishchivka has also been eliminated, with Russians also retreating entirely from there. So this is to say it's not to include Kurdiamivka, which I think is unlikely because it's a much larger area of controlled urban environment for the Russians there. But Avdiivka is a small couple of road village, really, and that would be somewhat easier for the Ukrainians to take control of. So no Russian presence there and no Russian presence left in Klishchivka, and I would think that is pretty plausible. So expect maybe by the end of tonight these to be under the control of the Ukrainians. And then it's a case of using that to, particularly in Avdiivka, to kind of roll down this railway track that acts as a barrier with two tree lines either side of it, in order to then put emphasis and a lot more pressure on Kurdiamivka. So Kurdiamivka can be attacked from the north across the canal here, from this kind of bridge across the canal. I mean, luckily it's not a natural bridge, because it could be blown up. So this is tunnels going through the earth, so the Ukrainians can get across there somewhat more easily than if it were a bridge. And we hear that there's been some success with Ukrainians south of Ozerenievka. So you put that all together, and you think Kurdiamivka is probably in trouble going forward, given that Avdiivka and Klishchivka are probably going to be under Ukrainian control imminently. So that's that situation. I'll check at the end of this video to see if anything has changed or has been added to that. If we go back to the Institute for the Study of War, there's nothing particularly that needs to be added to the Bakhmut claims, other than the usual, they're attacking here, repelled here, etc., Zalizniansky and Orokova Vasilivka, as I was talking about. But it does say Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister is emphasizing this point again. Hanna Malia, this was a couple of days ago now, that Russian forces are using various tactics in the Bakhmut direction in an attempt to distract Ukrainian forces and break up Ukrainian force concentrations. It's always interesting when, I absolutely think that is the case. I don't think that any kind of attacking elements of the Russian forces here have any intentions of, doing anything else. Nothing to do with Bakhmut intrinsically. Bakhmut is being used extrinsically, so it's being used as a value elsewhere. And its value is the value of the Russian forces working here is to cause a distraction and pull resources away from other places. But then the Ukrainians have very clearly said that they know that the Russians are doing this, and yet the Russians are still doing this. So unless they are actually pulling resources away from Zaporizhzhia, then it does make you wonder whether that intention is sensible from the Russians. So as we come down from Bakhmut, without too much change, there is a little bit of a rejig here for Syriac maps, a pro-Russian map. I don't think there's anything particularly interesting, and I'm not even sure it's correct. So rejigging to say that the Russians have a little bit more control there. But there appears to be quite a bit of pressure on Opitny from the Ukrainians. They push back down this salient and have taken the Russian control back. Some say, halfway through the village here. So let's have a look and see if there's any further sources. Well, I've been confidently told that this number and letter combination is a chemical formula for sarin. So I'm going to call this chap Sarin from now on. So Sarin, the Ukrainian source here, or pro-Ukrainian source, says, for the second day, the outskirts of Opitny, it's looking good for the Ukrainians. his map there is, as I say, showing a Russian defensive line sort of halfway through the village. So this is a site of quite a lot of history in terms of the conflict since 2014. So this airport was taken by the Russians and taken back by the Ukrainians, and then again taken by the Russians somewhat later. So there is a checkered history involving this airport. And it's going to be, I do want to see where this will go, whether anything is to be made of this, whether they're going to go for a concerted push, whether they have enough resources to do so. Avdiivka has been the site of some incredibly intense fighting along the lines of Bakhmut. I mean, the Ukrainians have lost a lot around Avdiivka, and the Russians have lost even more. It's just been an incredibly attritional zone, this, and it makes you wonder how much the Ukrainians have left in the tank around here to continue these kinds of attack. I mean, they've had some success around Novomaiorske as well, as I've said over the last few days, pushing the Russians back there towards Pisky, and that they've tried to, in fact, attack, I think, in that direction. The Russians have been trying to attack in the other direction in the same sort of places as well previously. There's been quite a lot of equipment lost around here from particularly the Russians there. But anyway, so that's that. We come down to Marinka, where a number of people are making claims about Marinka. Most of the pro-Russian sources are saying, yep, the Russians have made advances through the town. Here's Drisby Avenue, this central kind of road that goes north to south, south to north there. And that was, for quite a long time, the front line. And then gradually the Russians have been able to push the Ukrainians back, but there seems to have been a big jump over the last couple of days. Different mappers will say different things. Andrew Perpetua here in blue doesn't agree with Surrey maps, particularly in this kind of northern area. There's a little bit of difference there too. And for example, this mapper is not as charitable to the Russian control as maybe Surrey maps and others. Russia Global War Monitor says Russia has advanced in the settlement Marinka. The battle for this town has become the longest in modern history. So it's all happening there. I would err on the side of probably that Russia have had some success here. We've known that they've been able to get a tank up to this point and then drive it back without it getting destroyed. So I think it probably is fairly porous, and unless Ukraine are going to put in some more resources to Marinka, I'd say that it's a pretty perilous place for the Ukrainians at the moment. But we'll see if anything else particularly happens. I mean, you look through the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank here, and there's not an awful lot to be mentioned about the advances, other than, you know, there are claimed advances in recent weeks, etc., but nothing as serious as I think these mappers are suggesting. So that makes me go, interesting. But I do think the Russians have made some good headway in that town. Right, okay, as we come down to Donetsk, the southern Donetsk front line, we come to Vuhledar, which, you know, has been a scene of some intense fighting over the last year. I mean, this is where the Russians have had an equipment graveyard, as they've been hammered by mines and Ukrainian ATGMs and artillery. But nonetheless, Ukrainians are having a bit of joy here of late. They've pushed the Russians back into the outskirts of Mikhailska, and there seems to be either some gains here or a bit of rejigging. But as I said this morning, even if it's rejigging, this is significant because the Ukrainians have forced the Russians to move back on the edges of Pavlivka, and this is, I think that is fairly significant, quite important. So I believe this whole area could be a good place for a large-scale Ukrainian offensive to come in behind Volnovakha and circumvent some of the problematic trench lines and whatnot, and then get in behind the trenches and cause some havoc behind there. So that's just my speculation. I don't know that that's at all happened, but or will happen. We're going to move a little bit to the west now, past Shevchenko, where the Ukrainians have had some joy, to Novomaiorske and Novodonetsk. So there were rumors that there was fighting on the outskirts of Novodonetsk previously, and then Andrew Perpetua changed his mapping last night to show that actually the Ukrainians have moved into the kind of northern touches of Novomaiorske here. Well, there's been more of that coming out today. Rebar says of the whole area that they reckon, even though the Ukrainians have taken some heavy losses, as they normally say, the Ukrainians are generating some significant forces in the area for a future push. So this, where the Ukrainians have been quite quiet in the Velika Novosilka salient, or what they call the Vremivka sector, that has been as a result of refitting and getting ready to go again. While they've been doing that, unfortunately, the Russians, I think, have also been probably building up and preparing. But yeah, there has of late been a lot more activity in the settlements of Donetsk and Novomaiorske. And Rebar says, yep, they're building up. Ukrainian formations have prepared assault groups. They were given the task of reaching the northern outskirts of this settlement. Is at Staromaniivka. Oh no, Priutne. So they're looking at having a go at Staromaniivka, Priutne, and generally the whole area, of course. And that would be important. I think it appears that the Russians have had a bit more joy than Ukrainians north of Priutne of late, and that's a bit of a worry, but that's a counterattack that is going to trick their own forces, the Russian forces, and that might play into the hands of the Ukrainians, so that when they come to do their counterattack in the area or continue it, that the Russian forces will have exhausted themselves in their own kind of attempts at counterattacks. So anyway, it's all happening today still with Novodonetsk and Novomaiorske. Andrew Perpetua said last night that yesterday, he said this afternoon, earlier, but about yesterday. Yesterday, the satellite imagery showed Ukraine advance up to and into the northwestern edge of Novomaiorske. I very conservatively mapped this. I could tell from this evidence from Ukraine, evidence alone, that Ukraine had entered the town. So this is referring to Novomaiorske, this town here, or village, and his mapping change there, where you can see the very northern aspects of that settlement are not under Russian control. But he's saying that was super conservative, and that it appears that the Ukrainians had entered the town, and by that I would assume a little bit more than just that last building, maybe, or two. But he goes on to say today Russia published a video of Ukraine in the town, and I showed you a video of what was going to be an MRAP. I think Thierry was correct in saying, because it is a longer vehicle, didn't look like an MRAP, it looked more like a Striker, getting stuck on some mines, and then people getting out, and then it was struck by precision-guided munition or some kind of artillery, just a good shot with artillery on top, and it was a failed attack, but it looks like most of the Ukrainians survived from that, and that's the usefulness of this modern Western equipment. Nonetheless, the Russians are, this is a reference to a Russian video that's showing activity in Novomaiorske, and that the Ukrainians are trying to attack there. Sorry about that music. I presume it might be a bit turned around, but I presume that's showing up here and possibly attacking along to here. But I'm not sure actually, because it is going in the other direction. So they even give you an idea of where this is going. Yeah, in that direction. I can't work out exactly where that is. Actually I can. That is there. That is this. That's the Shaitanka River. Okay, we're going to come on and talk about that. So that is exactly what I was just showing you. So the Ukrainians have moved from here and moving to there, and that's a Russian video. But I can't work out from this video really what they're trying to say. I don't know if they're saying that they destroyed the Ukrainians there. They've got some buildings being hit, but it's not quite clear that it would have done anyone over and what's going on there. But that is to say that the Ukrainians are in Novomaiorske, and then Novy Reports uses the same Russian video to say Ukrainian forces, likely the 35th Brigade, landing in Novomaiorske while coming under Russian artillery fire. Russian sources consider the northwestern outskirts, the first several houses, under control of the Ukrainians. Russians said they have retreated to the centre of the settlement. In other words, as I was saying earlier, it's likely that Ukrainians have got further than just these houses, and that the Russians have retreated to the centre of the settlement, which would be somewhere around there. I'd imagine the Ukrainians are going to be moving slowly down there and dealing with all the obstacles and whatnot they would have to. And here is another version of that. Battles began for the village of Novomaiorske. Russia drone records that the AFU have been able to successfully cross the Shaitanka River, and that the blows were on the northern part of the village. Accordingly, the fireballs were thrown at least to the centre of the village, says Getty here. If we go and have a look at what that looks like. So again, this is that northern part there, and the Russians reportedly retreating to the centre of the village there. So yeah, Ukrainians in control of at least that northern part, grey zone going towards the middle there. So Novomaiorske could well be under an awful lot of pressure. Well, it is under an awful lot of pressure as the Ukrainians have got kind of this far. We'll see how that develops over the next 24 hours or so. Indeed, War Mapper has said that it is now a contested area, with only the kind of southern part of that, southeastern part of the Novomaiorske firmly under Russian control. Okay, so that's movement in that neck of the woods. We're going to come out of the Velika Novossilka salient and move to the west now. There's not too much to mention in the ISW that, other than, some Russian sources claim that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian attempts to cross the Shaitanka River. That was last night. And of course, now we've got evidence that they have crossed that river. Anyway, we're going to move to Robotyne, where not a lot of information has come out, to be perfectly honest. Really slim on the ground. I mean, this is the paragraph for Robotyne and Novopokrovka. And it doesn't really tell us much. I don't know whether the Ukrainians are regrouping. It's obviously going to be incredibly attritional here, and they'll be using a lot of troops and equipment and resources. And so sometimes you have to just step back and regroup before you go again, or it's just operational security, or it's just really, really difficult, and they aren't moving much because the Russians are defending pretty consistently. Right. Someone was asking that, if morale is so low and ammunition, they're not given ammunition and food and equipment, and we hear all these stories about the Russian troops. How is it they're still kind of defending? And I did share with you probably a month or so ago something along the lines of like, morale can make a difference, but if you've got a low morale bunch of troops in a trench and the enemy's running at them, they're still going to shoot their guns. They're still going to do everything they need to do to survive, right? Certain situations you might see surrender, but in the heat of those really hardcore battles, it's very difficult to say, I surrender now, because actually you're more likely to get shot, because no one's just going to be calm. You surrender I think you surrender in a slightly different context than that. So even given there's low morale, when you are in the heat of the battles here, the Russians are still going to be adequately able to defend these positions. In fact, they have the advantage because they're in defensive dug-in positions. So it's going to be difficult for Ukrainians to overcome them. It's still going to be challenging, despite the fact that they aren't going to be the best troops with the highest morale and the best equipment. But yeah, I'd be interested to see what your views on that might also be. We've got this claim that I talked about earlier from David D, saying, what, Russia's moving everything they can to try and just hold the ground here. They've got the whole, everything and the kitchen sink thrown at this, and they've got nothing left behind. So, after this happened, after the Ukrainians are able to break through, if they can indeed break through here, then the idea is that it might be not plain sailing, but somewhat easier, and they'll be able to advance more quickly. I hope that's true. It does certainly seem like that. So the Ukrainians have brought the 76th and the 3rd. They've got their airborne divisions here that are their best troops. The Russians have, the Ukrainians have their best troops as well fighting here. And as I said this morning, and you've got the heaviest defensive fortifications built here. So that's all the ingredients for, one of the most attritional pies that you could ever cook. And it's basically all about this area, really. You can argue this is where it's at, and this is arguably where it could be, somewhat decided too. and that's why everyone's looking at this area so intently. Anyway, the ISW, having said that, says relatively little about here because there hasn't been too much of a change over the last 24 hours. So we're going to go now to the Kherson River and see what there is to say about here. I'll be repeating what I said this morning with regard to a couple of Russian sources, but also the ISW. ISW says Homenyuk, so the head of the operational command in the south, stated that Russian forces suffer significant personnel and equipment losses from Ukrainian counter-battery activities in Kherson, limiting their combat effectiveness and likely forcing Russian forces to bring forward reserves currently operating in Crimea. So the idea that there aren't many reserves in Kherson behind these lines, that's what we were talking about with regard to the activities up in Robotyne. Well, there's not enough forces here, so they are having to bring in reserves from Crimea, which, do they have many there? And are there enough to bring to bear here in Kherson? Now, let's then go to these claims before we finish up saying what the ISW has to say, because I think actually it's a good time to bring in these claims because they are pertinent to that. So I'm going to go to the last claim I made this morning, which was from a Russian source. Another danger for our forces in the sector, so in the Kherson sector along the Dnipro River, is not just an insufficient personnel complement, so they don't have enough troops, exactly what Homenyuk was kind of saying, and they're having to bring something from Crimea, but the need for a numerical increase in the overall strength. Previously, due to the natural barrier of the Dnipro River, we could station N personnel per 1 kilometre of the front, and the ability to quickly shift reserves from one sector to another in case of need, such as a breakthrough. However, now, with the absence of this natural barrier, it requires N2 or N squared personnel, so more, just however many we have before, we need more now per kilometre. Even N personnel was barely sufficient, and whether we can hold the defence along Dnipro without having N2 or N squared personnel remains to be seen in the near future. So, yeah, really challenging for them there. They go on to say, or previously said, at present there are already areas where the adversary could cross the dried riverbed, so this is along the Dnipro, with highly mobile off-road vehicles such as buggies. By a curious coincidence, this is precisely the case in the Tavria direction, now referred to by the adversary as a Kherson front. Such means of transportation are much more mobile and versatile compared to tracked or heavy-wheeled vehicles. They are also less thermally contrasting for surveillance equipment and quieter, making them ideal for conducting raids with small reconnaissance and sabotage groups. Okay, so this is the Russians being quite concerned about the possibility of attacks across the Dnipro. I showed you various images, satellite images of the Dnipro and the Zaporizhzhia reservoir, and how in so many places it's dried, vegetation growing, and you could possibly entertain the idea of doing some attacks across some of these areas, maybe across the reservoir where the river hugs closely, the actual river now, in the absence of the water in the reservoir, the river hugs the Ukrainian side closely. So if you could bridge across there near where you are and then use mechanized equipment along this much more open and arguably dry enough land to get to the other side, then that could be an option for the Ukrainians. But it could also be an option further down the river, helping to find a place, to break through the Russian lines. And do they have enough troops to defend along there? Well, apparently not, as according to that Russian source. Now, ISW finishes. Russian sources claimed that Russian forces continue to respond to Ukrainian raids on the Dnipro River Delta. A Russian mobile blogger claimed that Russian forces pushed a small Ukrainian group off Kozatsky Island, which is west of Novomaiorske, following earlier reports of Ukrainian forces landing on the island a couple of days ago. Another Mill blogger claimed yesterday that fighting continues on the Dnipro River Delta Islands and that Russian forces repelled another Ukrainian landing on an island opposite Novomaiorske. So if we go to Novomaiorske here, here we see some islands that might well be the site of some fighting going on. See the Conquer River coming up there. The Conquer River sort of does quite a bit because it's the same one that's down here and comes down south of the Antonivsky Bridge as well, all the way down near, here we are, Konka River, all the way down near Kherson itself. So anyway, that is activity on the islands up near Novokakhovka, as well as activity on the islands, I think was it also to the west of, that's west of Novokakhovka as well, actually. So we know previously that there's been lots of activity on these islands towards the mouth of the river in the delta as it widens out southwest of Kherson. So there's lots of fighting and special forces happening there. But it appears likewise there's a lot of activity here just by Novokakhovka and the former hydroelectric dam there. Anyway, that's that for the mapping today. I'll just go and see if there's any latest news. No, not really. There's just quite a bit of activity taking place in Crimea at the moment. A few explosions near Simferopol, some units on fire there, as in military units, and some explosions, I think, over in this area of Crimea as well. So quite active on the in that neck of the woods. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. I may or may not have time to do an extra today. It might well be unlikely, but if I do have time, it will be here for your delectation. In the meantime, thanks so much to the very many supporters. Big shout out to Julian McFadden, John Maddox, Lee Thompson, John in Australia, Egon Frederickson. Thank you, Egon. Again, and Curtis Engel. Huge thanks to Curtis Engel. And IKDA12. So thank you for all of your support for the channel, and thanks to all the members. Thanks to everyone. Big loves. Speak to you soon.